This is English 101, week 13, part 4. Um, all right, so let's keep going. She has more examples of pleasure. So this is why this essay is pretty easy to go through because I don't have a lot to say here. Right now, it's just a list of examples. And then there are all the many things the dog does and says, entirely anthropomorphized and usually offensive, which express the universe of things we ourselves cannot do or say to each other or to other people. She's talking anthropomorphized means treated like a person. So she's saying that her and her husband pretend the dog is a person and say that it's like a joke that people have about their animals where they're like, oh, the animal wants this and the animal thinks that and the animal doesn't think, my cat doesn't think you should be dating that person. So the her and her husband play a game. It's very common for people with pets to do, is just to kind of pretend the pet understands their words and has opinions and preferences and things about things like politics or whatever. Right, this dog is I don't know what, but you make these little jokes about animals when you own animals, because when people own animals you tend to treat the animals like they're people, and then you can jokingly sort of talk about them like they're people. Okay, so that's what she's talking about, that game she plays with her husband where they make up voices and sentences for the dog. Um, and then there are all the many things the dog does and says, entirely anthropomorphized and usually offensive. Meaning they joke that the dog makes offensive jokes or makes offensive comments, which expresses the universe of things we ourselves cannot do or say to each other or to other people. You're being the dog, our child said recently, surprising us. She is almost 3, and all our private languages are losing their privacy and becoming known to her. Of course, we knew she would eventually become fully conscious, and that before this happened, we would have to give up arguing, smoking, eating meat, using the internet, talking about other people's faces, and voicing the dog. But now the time has come. She is fully aware, and we find ourselves unable to change. Stop being the dog, she said. It's very silly. And for the first time in 8 years, we looked at the dog and were ashamed. So it's just silly. She's joking about how her and her husband used to make up sentences. Oh, the dog says this. And a common thing at Christmas, sometimes you'll see people when they exchange presents. Like my in-laws came by and for Christmas, and they're like, oh, here's your Christmas present. And sometimes their presents are like, this is from mom, or this is from this is from mom, or this is from Santa. But sometimes they'll be like, this is from the dog, right? It's like a joke because the dog didn't really buy the present, but you just kind of joke like the dog's a member of the family and family members buy each other presents. So it's just like a little joke. And it's the private language of romance. When you live in a house with somebody, you often have a weird language that only people that live in your house understand. There's all these like coded words that you say. So like my wife and I, for example, will constantly talk to each other using lines from comedy sketches that we like. So like it's too complicated. The examples would take forever to explain to you. But we'll pick these like weird. She'll quote a sentence from a movie. Like she'll say, thank you for breakfast," and like that's not an interesting sentence if somebody overheard it. But I know the joke is that sentence comes from a serial killer movie, and it makes it funny because it's not a famous sentence. And so the fact that she quotes it like it's a seriously famous sentence from a movie when nobody but me would even know what fucking movie that's from. Anyway, it's that kind of thing. Okay, so she's basically done now with her examples of pleasure, and she's now going to start talking about joy. So the essay has not been super interesting so far, but let's try to get to talking about joy. Okay, because remember, she thinks there's a difference between pleasure and joy, because pleasure is everyday stuff that is fine and fits in with your everyday life. All of her examples are like eating food with my husband and watching people's faces with my husband and joking about the dog with my husband and our kid, right? But now when we get to the kid, we move on to joy. So let's find out what she thinks makes joy different. Okay. Occasionally, the child too is a pleasure, though mostly she is a joy, which means, in fact, she gives us not much pleasure at all, but rather that strange admixture, it really just means mixture, of terror, pain, and delight that I have come to recognize as joy, and now must find some way to live with daily. This is a new problem. Until quite recently, I had known joy only 5 times in my life, perhaps 6, and each time tried to forget it soon after it happened out of the fear that the memory of it would dement and destroy everything else. So now the essay is interesting. Now the essay has gotten complicated. So for starters, she says the child can be a pleasure, but mostly she's a joy, which means that she gives us not much pleasure at all, but rather that strange mixture of terror, pain, and delight that I've come to recognize as joy. See the fact that joy involves delight, but also terror and pain. Because, and again, you think about falling in love or drugs, which are such extreme feelings that they kind of overturn your life and can fuck your life up. Her example of an extreme feeling is not falling in love, although she'll have that later. But I was using falling in love and drugs. Um, but I think she's thinking of having a kid. Because again, it's like having children is very joyful, but like it's the kind of thing that changes your life forever, right? Like becoming a drug addict or falling in love or having a child. It's not just like, oh, this is like, oh, I had fun eating this sandwich, but I have so much fun with my child. It's not really like that. Joy is not like an extreme form of pleasure. It's like a separate thing that is hard. You have to kind of, when you get hit with joy, it's such a big emotion. It's so much bigger than you are that it involves you having to change your life. Again, so you can imagine how becoming a drug addict or falling in love with somebody who's a different religion that your family hates or having a child are these big radical experiences that change your life so much that like you don't want to have joy every day because you don't want your whole life flipped upside down every day, but you do want to have like a tasty sandwich every day. And that's the difference between pleasure and joy that she's talking about. Um, so she says she's only known joy 5 or 6 times in her life, and she tried to forget it out of the fear that the memory of it would dement and destroy everything else. She tries to forget it because her definition of joy is that it's so intense that to remember it would be to fuck up your life. Because, like, compared to that kind of joy, your day-to-day, everyday life would be unbearably boring. And so you have to kind of forget joy because it's so much, it's so intense. And again, you might think of some really passionate, intense love affair, but then you have to like go back to your regular life. Like, let's say you went to another country and had like an incredibly passionate love affair on a vacation with somebody, but then you have to go back to your life. If you think about that love affair so much, it could fuck up your life because now you're not paying attention. You feel like your whole life is boring. Your life feels not worth living because you're away from this person. How are you ever going to have that feeling again? It's a kind of intense. If you've ever been on a vacation that's like so incredible, amazing that you don't want to go back to your life, like that's joy. And again, so for discussion boards, you might want to think about examples of pleasure you can think of, things that you find pleasurable, but also things that you find joyful. She says she's only experienced joy 5 or 6 times in her life. And that she doesn't want to experience anymore because it will fuck up her life. And she's thinking of like having a kid. You might think about some of your own experiences of joy that you could use for the discussion board. Okay, I'm going to read that sentence again because I think it's really important. Until quite recently, I had known joy only 5 times in my life, perhaps 6, and each time tried to forget it soon after it happened, out of the fear the memory of it would dement and destroy everything else. So it's, I'm sorry, I'm gonna make sure I have a definition of the word dement. So dement means, where's the definition here? Insane. Right? I mean, we use the word demented in an insane asylum context, but she says it'll make her life insane. Like it sort of won't work anymore. Her life will sort of fall to pieces if she lets this happen. Okay, cool. I think this is going pretty good so far. So next up, she's going to talk about being in love as her example of joy. So we will pick that up, and we're well prepared for this with Plato. So let's pick up her example of love in the next part of this.